Good morning, all. Good morning. You're going to have 3 sessions now on Laurinburg and every southern community, be it a village or a town or a city. What happened between 1860 and 1865? And what we're going to find out is progressive deterioration. The home front, not the battlefield. The battlefield goes fairly well for up to 1863. Well, what about the home front? Wounds heal, deaths are accommodated, but what happens to that psychic deterioration on the home front? When the letters don't come, the information is not there, and we begin to see a real scrabble to stay alive at the level we want to stay. A story we don't know, but a story that's absolutely critical. And I'm thrilled, always, to have Dr. Martinez with us. What a joy, what a pleasure, what a gift. It's all yours, my friend.
Good morning, thank you. I feel like you're very far away, so I might wander a little bit, although I have a tripping hazard here, we'll see. And I also, as Bob was talking, I'm like, is that what I said I was going to talk about? I said home front, and I don't even remember what I said anymore beyond that. So I have a particular home front story for us today. I will have a different one next week. They're not necessarily well connected. They're just sort of little snippets of things I thought you might find interesting. And I'm also open to questions you might have and things we could explore as we move forward. So what I'm starting with today is a project and a story that I first encountered, oh my gosh, 20 plus years ago, while writing my dissertation on slavery in the Confederacy and the ways that the Confederate government used slave labor, and just this story of impressment of how the Confederate government got its supplies from its citizens and how that worked on the ground level, right? I was reading a lot of legislation and congressional debates and letters between the presidents and the governors and things like that. But what did actually gathering the stuff involve? Right? And I was fortunate enough to find one particular person's story about that. And so we're going to start there today. And I'm going to see if I can get the slides to work. These are showing differently from how they normally do. And so there we go. Okay, so we have to start, if we think about, there's only a home front because there's a war going on. And so we have to start in the context of the Confederate war effort with the logistical issues. Right? I was in a presentation once with the great Civil War military historian Carol Reardon, and she quoted, I don't know if it was Grant or one of the other high command, who said, captains study battlefield tactics, colonels study strategy, generals study logistics. Because ultimately, how you move the army around and feed the army and get its supplies has a huge impact on whether or not you can win anything. So that's what we mean by logistics, right? Getting the army from point A to point B, making sure they have supplies, arms, ammunition, particularly important, horses, wagons, medical supplies, food, all of these things are crucial, right? My students have often heard Napoleon, the army marches on its stomach. If you can't feed the soldiers, you have a problem. If you can't feed the home front, you also have a problem, as the Confederacy learned. Right? So, based on what we already know, or might be able to guess, what are some problems the Confederacy faced when it came to logistics? Yes?
Multi-gauge rail link.
Okay, so Confederacy has plenty of rail lines. Has the 4th most rail lines in the world in 1861. But they don't line up properly. They're different widths, they're different types, different manufacturers. So you have to like take the stuff off the trains and move it to a different train every time you go somewhere, and the lines change. So there's a rail network, but it's not well integrated. It also often follows rivers, but then doesn't crisscross properly the way you need it to get across the river. So some strengths in terms of transportation: great river network, an existing rail network, but not as well integrated as you need it to be successful. What are some other challenges that the Confederacy faced? Yeah, so particularly when it comes to encampments, right? It took, really by the end of the Mexican-American War, they had figured out that you want to keep your latrines downstream of your drinking source, but getting the men all on board with that took a while every time you set up a new encampment, if people were unfamiliar with how to do things. Right? And even just the reality of hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people and the horses and the mules and all the other thing, like stuff becomes contaminated really quickly. So you have to be very careful, because if everyone's sick, you're not going to get very far. What else? What are some logistical challenges? The roads are a problem, right? So depending on the season, sometimes the roads are really challenging to pass. And also, this is a place where rail lines and roads and railroad stock and bridges deteriorate over the course of the war. There's a lot of effort being put into building that stuff and getting that stuff up to snuff as quickly as possible, but there's no one in the Confederacy who knows how to repair a railroad engine. There's no factory in the Confederacy that's capable of building a railroad engine or car. So once your stock deteriorates, you have problems. Those things just hadn't been built prior to the war, and you can't get all of them up and running at the start of the war. You can build a bridge, right? But you can't build a factory and the know-how to design a train from scratch. So, yeah. So we have this multi-tiered government that doesn't always get along, right? And this, if you at the Ken Burns documentary at the end, he says the Confederacy died of a theory, right? Because the states don't support the federal government and the supplies don't get where they need to go. Right? And part of what I'm going to suggest here is that theory is maybe a little overused to explain the Confederacy. I think it was better organized than we like to think it was, and became better organized because it had to be. But initially, at first, there's no centralization of anything. And so how do you put together a national army when you don't have a national system of gathering men or supplies, right, to do it? Right? So all of these things are challenges. Then we think about the fact that if 80% of the men are in the army, how do you make sure the crops are still getting grown and processed to be transported? Right? And so we have just a labor shortage that creates logistical problems. So all of these things are day-to-day challenges when it comes to provisioning and functioning with the Confederate Army. So impressment is the government essentially taking your stuff. Right? It's a very fancy word for the government taking your stuff. There's a bunch of different ways that the Confederate government takes people's stuff. First are taxes. Right? We're all familiar with taxes. But because agrarian economies like the Confederacy tend to be low on cash, what they often have is a tax in kind. So you don't have you have a small tax bill in cash, but you also have 10% of your crop, whether it's wheat, corn, cotton, whatever it is you are growing, 10% of your livestock. Right? And those things are kind of set by law and happen at certain points in time. Right? Impressment is the army's in your yard, and they can take whatever they want that is of military use. Right? So, your horses. They can take down your fence and burn it as firewood so that the soldiers can stay warm overnight. They can take your food supplies. They can take your alcohol for the benefit of the hospital tent. They can't just hand it out to anyone. They can't take your clothing, because that's not necessarily of military value. They shouldn't be taking your gold and silver, although they might, if they want to say, hey, we need the money. They can take your slaves. Right? They can take your crops, they can take your pigs, your cows to feed the army, but they can take your slaves and your wagons and your horses. And what happens is initially very chaotic. So if the army happens to be near you, they'll take your stuff. And if they're taking things like horses, wagons, slaves, implements, they usually bring them back in a couple of months. And you hopefully get some sort of receipt. And the promise is the government will pay you for their use. If the army's nowhere near you, you might never encounter this in the first year and a half of the war. Doesn't affect you. Don't even know what's going on. Right? So some people are getting sort of constantly called upon to hand things over through impressment processes, and other people are left out of the process entirely. And then also, the Confederate officers going out into the countryside to collect stuff are encountering more and more people who resist these calls to take their stuff. And they're like, we just gave you a month ago. Why are you back? And is this even legal? So what happens in the fall of 1862 is we see about half of the states in the Confederacy pass laws that say this is legal, and here's the process by which it's going to happen. And here's the process by which the burden will be distributed more evenly across the state rather than just on the same 5 or 6 communities over and over again because they happen to be near Newport or they're Wilmington or one of these areas where the Confederacy is trying to fortify. Right? And so in Virginia, for example, when it comes to slave labor, the law says the engineer leadership will go to the governor, or actually go to the Secretary of War. The Secretary of War will talk to the governor of Virginia. The governor of Virginia will approve the call and send it out to the counties, and the county courts will decide how to gather up the slaves and send them, right? So there's this very regimented process, which is made more functional by the fact that when you're thinking about like the head of the Engineer Corps, the Confederate Secretary of War, and the governor of Virginia are all located within a couple blocks of each other, right? So it's fairly easy to communicate. Other states, the process doesn't require quite so much routing through Richmond, but in North Carolina, for example, it says if a Confederate general or head of an installation of one of these fortification spots needs laborers, needs horses, needs mules, needs wagons, whatever, he can appeal to the governor, and the governor will direct the militias to gather those things and bring them to the place where they're needed. Right? So there's a process and there's an expectation. Right? And what they start doing is appointing local agents to be responsible for all of this. So the county government will pick a person, not a member of the militia perhaps, but a civilian or someone who at least appears to be a civilian, to handle gathering the things and communicating with the people on orders from the county government. So there's this sense that it's happening through elected officials, right, rather than the army just coming in and taking your things, right? But you voted for your county officials, and they're deciding how to distribute this burden. So the state has said you need to do X, Y, and Z for the benefit of the army, but your local officials determine how to do that in your community in the way that's most appropriate for your community. And that seems to go over better for people than this like heavy-handed government taking your stuff. It's the same effect, right? But putting the local face on it and perhaps some local compassion when possible. Right? Someone you trust, someone you have a kind of a history with as your leader in your community, I think helps make the process work better for a lot of people. Eventually we get Confederate level laws that set this up. And it still continues to operate a little differently in each state, because if there's an existing state law, the Confederate law says we follow that. And so every process is a little bit different along the way. So, and I just kind of skipped all of this, right? But that's what I was saying. Okay, I should look at my own notes. So, the person I want to walk you through some time with today is a man named William Daniel Cabell. And I encountered William Daniel Cabell's journal when I was writing about impressment, and slave impressment specifically, because he ended up being the local impressment agent for Nelson County, Virginia. The Cabell family is a large and extremely wealthy planter family in central Virginia. If you go to the University of Virginia, the largest and most important building, of course, is Jefferson's Rotunda. The second largest and second most important building is Cabell Hall. And in fact, there's Old Cabell Hall and New Cabell Hall and like Cabell Hall Extension, and half the streets are named Cabell something or other. The Cabells obviously had a lot of money, and they're entrenched in these plantations along the James River in central Virginia. Not all the way to Richmond, but Albemarle County, where the University of Virginia is, Nelson County, south of that, where William Daniel Cabell and his father lived, Fluvanna, up kind of to the east of Albemarle as the river curves around. William Daniel Cabell spent a lot of time going up and down the river and usually stayed with extended relatives everywhere he stopped because they just owned plantations all along the James. So he's like connected, but he's not part of the wealthiest branch of the family. Nelson County is like the poor part of the area, and he's the lower branch of the family, and he's a second son of the lower branch. So he has his own land, he has his own plantation. He married well, and his wife brought some money and land and slaves into the arrangement. He was actually working as a teacher when the war started. He was in the army for a while, and then his wife passed away, and his brother-in-law passed away, and he was now responsible solely for his own children and his nieces and nephews, and 2 plantations. And so he was detailed home as a farmer. And this happened fairly often, that someone who had a decent-sized plantation and was growing grain crops and raising livestock that the Army needed would be drafted or enlisted and trained and go through the whole process and then be so, okay, your current job, your current responsibility for the Army is to go home and get your crop in. We'll call you up if we need you. But for right now, you are more valuable as a farmer than as a soldier. So he's detailed home as a farmer initially, and then brought into this impressment system and told, hey, you're the local militia leader. You show, everyone knows you. You show up, you drill the militia. You're from this very prominent family that's well respected, that's seen as sort of charitable and respectable in the community. So you're now responsible for this whole operation of gathering the food and supplies from Nelson County to take them to Richmond or to Lynchburg or Charlottesville or wherever exactly in the area the Army needs them. So that's his job from early 1863 onwards. Right? He does this for much of the war. And I want to take us just through his summer of 1864. So May through August 1864, we're going to follow him on his journeys as I transcribed his diary. But I want to set the scene a little bit. So what do we know about May through August 1864 in Virginia? What's going on? Anyone? It's the 4th summer of the war.
Lee's armies everywhere.
The armies are everywhere, right? Lee's army, Grant's army now. Right? I guess technically still Meade's army, but really Grant's army. Stonewall Jackson, not Stonewall Jackson, sorry, wrong summer. Sherman's running around in the valley, right, not too far away. There are 3 Union armies and 2 Confederate armies operating in Virginia in the summer of 1864. right? So there's a lot going on, and these Confederate armies are large, and they need to be fed. Right? We have what's known as the Overland Campaign, right? That same area between Fredericksburg, Spotsylvania, heading toward Richmond. By the end of the summer, we have everyone dug in around Petersburg, right? That's the main action. It's east of where Cabell is, right? But it's connected by the James River, right? Which is the longest river that stays entirely in one state, apparently. And it's beautiful, and it's navigable, this whole way that he's moving, right? So he is responsible for feeding that army that's operating constantly outside of Richmond and then settling into the trenches at Petersburg. So this is a lot of responsibility, a lot of expectations. He's also getting called up to the militia because the army is operating nearby. It's not, the Shenandoah Valley is not very far away. We have a huge installation at Lynchburg of railroads and supply depots and hospitals. We have something similar going on in Charlottesville. So when that Shenandoah Valley campaign of 1864 gets underway, right, he's needed to defend against that. So he's sort of constantly going back and forth between these various responsibilities. All right. Now I'm going to try to get us to, oh, that didn't work. I'm going to pull up the map, which I built online. And this is called Story Map. A lot of news organizations use these now on their websites to kind of tell a story in a specific place. And so we're going to follow Cabell. And sometimes I've summarized what's in his journal, and sometimes I've put it just sort of verbatim. Right, but this is a picture of him. It's a little blurry. His plantation on the James River in Nelson County, right? We see the outline of Nelson County here, right? And then just above it is Albemarle, which is where the university is, and Charlottesville, and then we get Fluvanna. Richmond is down this way, right? Lynchburg is down here. Right? So sort of between Lynchburg and Charlottesville, and then Richmond is kind of the triangle over that way. Right? So early May, he is at his plantation, which his father built for him 10 years earlier as a college graduation present, pretty nice present. He's writing about his crops, he's writing about his children, he's making sure his nephew's school fees are paid. You know, he's kind of doing the work around home. He also hops 2 miles up and down the river to check in on his father and his father's plantation. His father is the wealthiest man in the county, and he is now old enough that he is no longer concerned about the draft rules of the Confederacy, but he's still fairly active in the community, and perhaps is the reason why William Daniel Cabell got this position as impressment agent, because his father's so well respected. So at least twice in those days he's there. 7 miles away is the train depot, Arrington Depot. He seems to have gone through there on May 4th en route to Lynchburg. You can take the train down to Lynchburg. In his diary, he talks about going to church, visiting with family, going and getting some banking done, purchasing things for his farm. So sort of typical early spring or mid-spring visit to the big town to get your supplies and keep going. So not early May, he's kind of doing what every farmer would have been doing in early May. He comes back through the Arrington Depot 2 days later, and he talks about picking up, right, 57.5 bushels of corn for the county that one of his deputies had collected, right? So he's the impressment agent, but he has deputies out there helping him do the work. They've collected 57.5 bushels and brought it to Variety Mills. Right? For the county could mean two things, and I'm not really sure yet. Right? It could mean this is the county's contribution to the Army. Right? That's a possibility. It could also mean This is for the people in the county. Because one of the things that happened in the aftermath of the summer of 1863, when there were bread riots in Richmond and other places in the Confederacy, is laws were passed that allowed these impressment agents to purchase food at government prices. Right? So there's price controls. If you're buying for the government, if you can't, you're supposed to purchase before you impress, right? But you're purchasing at reduced rates with price controls. And now you can purchase at government prices and then distribute it among the poor of your community. So particularly, you're supposed to distribute it to the widows of Confederate soldiers. So one of the ways the Confederate government takes care of the widows and orphans of soldiers is by empowering local governments to take care of them, rather than sort of direct contributions. There's direct welfare or anything like that. It's sort of indirect. So it's not clear from his diary yet to me if this 57.5 bushels was to take to Richmond in a couple days or was actually being distributed locally. That's one of the questions we're working on figuring out. But he's taken it to the mill, presumably to be milled from corn to cornmeal. Right? May 7th, he's drilling the local militia 12 miles away from his house in the county seat, which is now called Lovingston, but at the time does not seem to have been called Lovingston, possibly was referred to as the New Market, because we see New Market show up later in his diary, and he doesn't mean New Market all the way up in the Shenandoah Valley. He's back home for a few days, dealing with a pretty serious problem in May 1864, and this was actually reported in a number of places throughout Virginia. Family barns being set on fire. 3 of his father's barns caught fire, potentially, likely, it seems, due to arson. Right? But this is before the Valley Campaign is underway, so it's something else going on. A lot of speculation that there's a slave uprising coming when these barns start to go on fire, but it never quite materializes. Middle of May, we're 2 weeks into the summer already, and he's been all over the place. Back in Lynchburg with the militia company. Right? There's cavalry in there. Maybe the cavalry did set the barn on fire. Unclear. Certainly you'd be speculating that and talking about it, and there are all sorts of rumors flying around. Right? Militia unit went home, cavalry went to Richmond. This time not on government business, right, for the Missionary Society. He came back from Richmond, spent a week on the farm, noted that three batteries traveled through his plantation in that week, right, along the river, right, and ate some of his clover. Here we go. This is a late 19th century map of Nelson County. Right? So Norwood, you can actually see on the map at this curve toward the bottom of the river. Right? Arrington Depot, further into the center of the county is the county seat of Lovingston. And then you can see Albemarle, Buckingham, Amherst, Lynchburg's down here. Charlottesville's kind of up that way on the map. Right? And the river curves back down around to Richmond. From May 29th to May 31st, his diary is full of him just going everywhere in the county. Right? For the men who were, specifically they're collecting supplies for the wounded from the first phases of the Overland Campaign. 51 sheep, 14 calves, 2 steers that he put on a barge on the evening of May 31st. The barge belonged to his father. He was borrowing it, and he set it off toward Richmond and then followed the river on horseback. So on June 2nd, as his barge is traveling, he stops to spend the evening with relatives in Fluvanna County at what's known as the Lower Bramo Plantation. And by June 5th, he is in Richmond. And he delivers the 41 sheep, 14 calves, and 2 steer to feed the wounded to the quartermaster's department. Purchased some supplies, put him on his barge, bought himself a new horse, because his horse was tired after this point, and heads back up the river on June 7th. This time he stays at a different relative's plantation. This one is called Bramo Bluff, Upper Bramo as opposed to Lower Bramo that he stayed with the first time through. And his father's second home as well, Liberty Hall, which is 11 miles from his house, is where he stayed on his second night of the journey. So again, just kind of owning half of the riverfront property between Lynchburg and Richmond. That's the Cabell family. By the middle of June, he's at home, and he is once again gathering up what he says fresh meat, engaged all day, moving around the county. I assume the meat has not yet been slaughtered, but he's not entirely clear, and he doesn't say exactly where. Right? But everyone in the county, presumably, is expected to contribute in some way. So June 11th, he has collected all the supplies at the Arrington Depot, and then he heads off to militia duty, because again, there's at least rumors and reports of Union raids. And not all, so he stores all the grain in the depot, heads off with the militia to counter a raid, and the raiders instead come by the train depot and burn it to the ground and destroy all of the grain that he just spent several days collecting and storing there. So I imagined he was pretty annoyed at this point. But it's just got to keep going. He's in Lynchburg 2 days later, primarily patrolling in Amherst County, which is north of Lynchburg and sort of directly south of his plantation, right? You can almost see Norwood. It's that curve in the river just north of Amherst County over there. Militia work in this case was mostly focused on finding Confederate stragglers and bringing them back to their units, right? So not the fun kind of militia work either, right? So I can't imagine this made him feel any better, right? There's raids in Campbell County, which is just south of Lynchburg. So there's a lot of activity, right? The armies are everywhere, and he's constantly being pulled in and out. He spends June 17th, 18th, and 19th in camp with the militia, but does talk about going home every day to check in on his plantation, right? Which is about 12 miles away from where he's encamped. So he's making a lot of ground.
Who makes up the militia?
At this point, it is people who've been detailed, like Cabell, right? People who are a little bit too old or a little bit too young to be drafted, right? Or people who, part of why Cabell was sent home is he was not in the best health in camp, and he was sort of struggling to be an effective soldier in the full-time army, right? He got sick. He didn't really recover all that well, so they thought maybe, again, he'd be more useful in other ways. So there are people in the militia who had been perhaps wounded enough that they weren't all that useful in the army, but not wounded enough that they couldn't get around, and so they might be in the militia. So the militia, but it's also, there have been people who've been specifically detailed to go back and kind of local, because the militia is sort of functioning as the local police force as well as having these military duties. And so some people, if they're county officials, they're detailed home to be in the county government, so they're given a draft exemption to be the county government. If you're the sheriff and the sheriff's deputies, you get a draft exemption from that, but then you're expected to show up for things like the militia. Right? It's also the case if you're the sheriff or a county government official and you've been granted a draft exemption for that purpose, if you refuse to, by the end of the war, by this point, I was already in Virginia law from April 1864 onward, or May 1864, if you refuse to comply with impressment orders, you lose your draft exemption and you get stuck in the army. So there's a lot of incentive for people to do this work, or they're going back to the army full time. So the militia is a combination of people who are perhaps extremely competent and people who are not quite up to snuff. and people who are just either a little bit too young or a little bit too old to be in the regular Army, right? Who may be really good at what they're doing as well. And also when we talk about, like, North Carolina will boast it had like 95% of white male military-age men served in the Confederate forces. They're talking about the Army, the militia, the local force, like all of it, right? That not just the Confederate Army, like they're counting everything, right? Which is still a really impressive high level of enlistment here. But not everyone is in the full Army, often in battle at all times, or in camp more often than in battle. Right? Cabell finally gets to go home and get in his crop. He spent a lot of time complaining about how he wasn't getting in his crop while he was with the militia. He goes home June 20th, has a few days to harvest his wheat, harvest his hay so he can feed his livestock. And then he's ordered to a meeting with the commissary department, presumably to talk about the supplies he is supposed to be gathering. He takes the train up to Charlottesville. He's stuck there for a couple of days until he can get a train home. So this section actually directly quoted in about 10-day period, or maybe a 2-week period. June 28th, he gets home, and he has letters immediately to hurry up with collecting the wheat crop and getting it in, right? So then on June 29th, he starts riding around, getting supplies for the soldiers, getting supplies for the wounded. Can't go because he has no one to help him run the boat, right? So he has the supplies, he has the boat, he has no hands. Hands might mean, free men who knew how to run a boat. Hands also sometimes means slaves. Depends on the context, right? And also the boat maybe is broken. Right? There's a couple points where he has to borrow money from his father to buy new boats, right? So that they're using their own resources to do a lot of this work along the way. Messages have been sent July 3rd. Get your stuff ready. We are leaving soon. We are taking supplies. Right? So it should say July. By July 7th, he is on his way. He spends the night at Lower Bramo. By July 8th, he's in Richmond with the supplies. He spent 3 days there, and then he came back. Right? He stopped at the encampment at Belmead to get a sense of where the supplies were going, to see the soldiers, to visit perhaps with people from his county who were encamped there. Back at the extended family plantation in Fluvanna County, his father's second home, and by July 15th he's home. So it takes him about a week typically to make the trip to Richmond and back. He could probably do it a little faster, but it seems like he has errands that need to be done along the way. If you're going anyway, right? Immediately he goes up to Charlottesville to again check in with the commissary department to get his next set of orders. Then he gets to spend about 2 weeks in the general vicinity of his home, which I imagine he appreciates. He is dealing with his wheat, shipped to Captain Welford, 265 bushels of wheat in 136 bags for the Confederate States government. So that's not just his, right, but a good portion of that is. He goes to the court, he talks with the farmers, he's trying to get everyone to hand in their wheat. Right? 2 barrels of flour to the market for the poor of our community. This is where, when he says new market and then poor of our community, I think new market is the market, the newer market town in Nelson County that has perhaps a different name now in the 21st century. So by July 30th, he's trying to gather the supplies and get everything where it needs to go, and particularly for the poor of the community. August 1st, he's at the train depot, checking on prices of sheep and cattle. Again, you're supposed to buy at government prices before you impress. 30 head of cattle engaged to be shipped next Wednesday. So again, 30 head of cattle on barges down the James River, which is why you need some hands to help you with this, right? So he's on his way by August 4th, right? He's back at Lower Bramo. By August 5th, he's in Richmond again. August 9th, he's already on his way home. So this is maybe a shorter trip. He's at home on August 10th. He goes to a different train depot than he normally goes, the Ty River Depot, just to get a list of everything that's been shipped, right? He's concentrated at one depot, one of his deputies is at the other. He needs their records. Gets the records, checks on his own depot, checks on the next one up the thing. He's managing his staff, right? August 13th, back to Charlottesville. Particular directions, He says, I gave particular directions to agents about receipts and shipments, right? Maybe he didn't like the quality of the records he received the previous couple of days. Needs to give better directions. Right? He leaves his horse at the depot, goes to Charlottesville to again see the commissary agent. Again, second half of August, he mostly is around his own plantation, but he's gathering. He's gathering things, and he has another trip to Richmond planned. Right? Pays off all the government claims. So he collected the supplies. He gave people receipts. He went to Richmond. They gave him money. He has to pay the people when he gets back. Right? He's paying them, of course, in Confederate paper currency. By the summer of 1864, inflation is somewhere around 500%. Right? So people are getting paid at, first of all, government prices, so less than they could get on the open market, with currency that is relatively worthless. So it seems like you're getting a lot of money, and then you can't buy much with what you get. People talk about, the barrels of flour going for several $100s, which is just astronomical, but also nobody wants Confederate currency, so what difference does it make? He's collecting stock and wheat. He rides up to his father's house to pay him for using his boat. Right? So the government is, in fact, refunding the Cabells for using their private property for this work. Right? He receives a letter with directions. Right? So he knows the next step is just to set off again with the next shipment. And this happens over and over again throughout the fall, right? So he's up in Charlottesville to get his orders, he's back to Norwood, and then in September he sets off to Richmond. Right? And this is what happens, every couple of weeks he's down there with all this stuff he's collected. He's riding all over the county. So this is kind of the day-to-day life of someone helping to make sure that the Army can function throughout the Overland campaign. Let's see if I can, okay.
Is all this travel by horse and train?
Train and horse mostly. The supplies are going on a barge, but it seems like he rides his horse along the river rather than going on the barge with them. But yeah, when he's going on his own, between, particularly up to Charlottesville or down to Lynchburg, he does seem to take the train regularly. So the trains are still running. People complain a lot about how slow the passenger trains are because anytime the Army needs them or they need it, you can be waiting there for a while and the soldiers get priority, as they should, right? Or how crowded the trains are when the soldiers need to be there. Or they'll talk about seeing, the slaves gathered up being taken on the train or the supplies, right? So some people are shipping supplies by train, right? But it seems to be more convenient for Cabell to send them on a barge. But yeah, he does also seem to be on his horse a lot. So, I was saying to Bob beforehand, I started transcribing Cabell's diary in 2019, and then it just sort of became one of those things I stopped doing during the pandemic and never picked back up again. So I've been looking at it lately and wondering if I want to get back into it and what I might do with it and where it's going to go. And I was thinking as well about what are the themes, right? This is like, okay, fine, what does this guy have to do with anything, right? What is the broader point? First of all, right, his story is one that makes it very clear, and he's certainly not the only one, right, that the line between the battlefield and the home front is really blurry. Right? It's blurry in many places in the Confederacy at various points in time, but especially if we're looking at Confederate Virginia, in 64, right? You're always seeing both kind of overlapping, right? And so it's hard to say what is home front and what is military space, both sort of geographically physical space, but also what people's jobs are, right? He's collecting food for the Army, except sometimes the food is not going to the Army, it's going to the poor of the county. And both of those things benefit the Army. Because if the soldiers are getting letters from their wives saying, we're starving, come home, the Army has a problem, right? So it benefits the Army to make sure the civilians get fed, right? So these things all interact with each other on a day-to-day basis, particularly in Virginia, but also, there's huge swaths of eastern North Carolina where these things are constantly on top of each other as well. By the summer of 64, there is no civilian market to be spoken of, not really. Right? Even whatever civilian market there is still largely dominated by what the Army needs. Right? So if you're not purchasing for the Army, you're probably not going to be able to buy anything. Right? But again, purchasing for the Army can include buying things for civilians that the government has deemed necessary for the Army. Right? So there's that curious overlap of things. Right? If you want laborers, if you want goods, and you are not connected to the military, you are going to have a hard time getting them. If you have extra goods or laborers to sell or rent, overwhelming likelihood is that they're going to the Army. Right? It's hard to find anyone in town who isn't constrained in some way by the rules necessary to support the Confederate Army. And again, that is more pronounced in Virginia than most places in the Confederacy, but it's the reality most places in the Confederacy. The Confederate government is increasingly engaged in directing economic activity. In the summer of 1863, there's elections for the Confederate Congress, and the congressmen who are elected in 1863 tend to have been members of the Whig Party. And the Whig Party believed that the government should be actively involved in directing the economy. Right? And they felt like the only way to win the war was to have this much more engaged, aggressively centralizing Confederate government. And they did that. Right? So everywhere in the Confederacy, it is hard to avoid the tentacles of the government. They might not look like the Confederate government, right? It's your local school teacher who's been hired to do this on behalf of the Confederate government, right? But it is still this really activist, engaged, quasi-socialistic Confederate government economic operation. What we learned from Cabell's diary is that this is a lot of work, but it's getting the job done. He is making a lot of progress day to day. Right? And for the most part, people are okay with it. There's grumbling. Like, nobody likes to pay their taxes. Nobody likes to give their stuff to the government. But for the most part, people are doing what he asks them to. Right? And he's upholding his end of the bargain. He's making sure they get paid. He's keeping the records. He's doing the job faithfully. Right? And the voters in this part of Virginia are largely okay with it. Particularly the sort of middling classes are okay with it because they see it as, okay, I'm doing my part. I sent my son or my brother or my husband or all three to the Army, and I'll pay my tariffs and my taxes and my tax in kind, and I'll send things when they're impressed because I see that the wealthy members of my community are also being forced to do that. Right? And I'm okay with it because everyone is on board. What's interesting, I found a letter from William Daniel Cabell's father and some of the other planters of Nelson County asking to be annexed into Albemarle County because they were the economic leaders of Nelson County and therefore were being asked to pay the heaviest burden at this particular point in time. And if they had been added to Albemarle County, which was larger and richer and had lots of people with more money than them, they would in fact be asked to give less to the Confederacy. So the old, canard of the rich man's war and the poor man's fight is not entirely true, but also not entirely false, right? And the rich people are looking for ways to do less than their share. But William W. Cabell is part of that group who is of the wealthiest of the community, and he's out there doing this work all the time. And also, look, you'll see there's things in his diary where he says, Mrs. So-and-so called, she's very upset about her one slave being taken, and I told her it's her turn, right? Everyone who has at least 5 slaves 5 male slaves is always sending one every call, and everyone who's below that is sort of taking turns. And I told her it's her turn. She has to comply with the law, but also I'm going to send Sam over to her house on Saturday to help out a little bit. Right? So he's trying to mitigate this when he can for particularly the women whose husbands are off in the Army. And so again, we see that local face on the government policy that makes it maybe a little more palatable for people, and also a little harder to see as like government overreach, because it's your neighbor, right, who's always been the militia leader, or at least has been for the last 5 years, and always was the one at the county court keeping track of whose wheat crop did what. I mean, some of this stuff is just sort of trading on existing patterns. So that's kind of what I have at this point with this particular story. Next time I wanted to talk more about these wives and widows of soldiers and how they're coping and keeping their farms going and supporting the Confederacy or protesting against the Confederacy or both at the same time, and get a sense of what the home front looked like from their perspective. And then, as I said, there's a couple of things we could do in my third week here, and if you have any ideas or questions, we can entertain them and see where they go. But it is not quite 12 o'clock, so I'm curious what questions you have now. Yes?
Was there a constant shift towards a more matriarchal society as the war progressed? Or is it still just male-dominated and the women did what they were told?
Well, was it Elizabeth Fox Genovese who described the slaveholders' wives as the iron fist inside the velvet glove? I'm not sure they ever entirely did what they were told. So society remains relatively patriarchal, right, in its official functions. Right? But certainly what we see is women saying, I've given up things for this war, and the government owes me something. You took my husband, you took my son, you took my ability to get to slaughter a pig and feed my family, because that takes multiple adults to do, right? And so you owe me something. Right? So there is this sense of like, it's still patriarchal though, right? I am a woman, I am a married woman, I have no legal or political identity on my own. I expect to be protected by a head of household, and if the government is drafting or enlisting my head of household, I expect someone else to take that role, whether it's the government or local men of my community who aren't going off to the Army. So I think a lot of what they're doing is trying to kind of demand, and we'll talk more about this next time, but demand that the promises of the patriarchal society be upheld, right? And what that means for women in terms of their status and their protection.
Is there a sense in the summer of 1864 that the Confederacy is doomed?
No. They are absolutely convinced that they are going to keep going, that at any moment, first of all, it's easy for us to look back and say, well, Grant was so effective, right? Obviously, you put Grant and Lee together, and you finally have a good match in terms of leadership of generals. And then Grant has a lot more men and material, right? But in May 1864, if you're in Virginia, sure, Grant, come on, your turn. You take a shot at Lee. Right? He's beaten everyone else. Why won't he beat Grant too? Right? And the responses go from that sort of general. Okay, sure, it's gotten harder, But Robert E. Lee has defeated every Union general they've thrown at him. We believe he can do this one too, right? To the utterly fantastical, there are rumors that Stonewall Jackson isn't really dead and he's coming to everyone's rescue. I mean, all sorts of things, right? But yeah, I think until the moment Lee surrenders his army, people in Confederate Virginia and really throughout the Confederacy think they still have a shot.
Is that even though Sherman was cutting the legs out from underneath him in the South?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's interesting if you look at the letters and the responses to Sherman's march, is when he's approaching, people are terrified. When he's gone through, they're furious. And the response is, we cannot possibly surrender to these people because we cannot possibly live in a community with people who will do things like this. So keep fighting till the bitter end. So I think it has the exact opposite effect of what Sherman had in mind. And just to a lesser extent, Sheridan and the Valley destroying supplies and just really annoying, excuse my language, pissing people off. Right? And they're enraged to the point where they are no longer even willing to consider compromise, right? For the most part. Sure, there are people who are absolutely devastated and say, fine, I give up. Right? But I think the overall ethos is we have to do whatever we can to become independent because we cannot be friends with these people ever again.
I had to look up exactly what year it was. The siege of Petersburg, the people at the home front there were affected hard.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, I mean, we were talking about summer of '64, so that's getting started by the end of the summer, right? And people are evacuating their homes, right? Or hunkering down. There's a number of, and every siege of Confederate city eventually ends the same way. It's just a matter of time. But yeah, I think there's, I'm trying to think of the exact, there are some books that talk about Petersburg and sort of what it was like to be inside the city, yeah.
I didn't know about it until we visited one time to the museum.
Yeah,
And one of the houses was the bed and breakfast we stayed in was pre-Civil War. And they had all this stuff written there about eating birds they shot in the yard.
yeah, and part of why the siege of Petersburg lasted as long as it did is there were still supplies coming in, right? So the army still controlled access at one point. They had a rail line, they had the river, right? And so Petersburg was able to get some things in, which kept them going for 9 months. But yeah, there are definitely stories of the civilian experience in Petersburg. Disease becomes a huge problem in these cities where everyone is cooped up for long periods of time. So there's concerns about yellow fever and things like that over the winter. Vicksburg, of course, endured a long siege, and people were living in caves in the hillsides, and they talk about that. And they were really completely surrounded and couldn't get anything in. So yeah, there are really, and again, these are the stories from people who were the least willing to accept surrender because of what they'd endured. All right, so we will talk more about the women's experience next time. Sound good? All right.
Lots of thought. Lots of thought. Go in peace. Enjoy the week.